Good morning, everybody, and it's an honor to be here. I'm going to be presenting my paper, Doing More Harm Than Good, Labor Market Consequences of Paid Maternity Leave in India. So shifting the conversation a little bit away from the cash transfers, but in line with what Gabriel just mentioned, there are certain barriers to entry or women employment itself. And so I'm going to touch on one such aspect, which is maternity leave. I just want to give a quick disclaimer. None of these findings are affiliated to the World Bank. These are all my personal results. So the big question here is, like, the paid maternity leave itself, as you might all be aware, are being widely adopted by countries for the purpose of improving female employment and diminishing the quote-unquote motherhood penalty. But there are certain countries which are adopting generous maternity leave or as well like parental leave policies. But the question is, can these generous and seemingly progressive paid maternity leave policies lead to negative consequences on female employment? There has been limited empirical evidence on the impact of long parental leaves, especially for gendered labor outcomes. As you see in the figure on the left, there is a WHO recommendation which says that women should have at least 18 weeks of maternity leave, preferably 6 months, for paid maternity leaves in order for the benefit of the child and the mother. When India adopted this policy, the recommendation, and implemented a 6-month paid maternity leave, there were two types of articles that were published. On the top, you see, on the right top, you see that this is a US news article which says, India's new maternity leave policy puts US to absolute shame. As some of you might be aware, US doesn't have a federal paid maternity leave policy, so people were perceiving that this is relatively, India is going ahead of US. While the Indian media reported that India becomes the leader in maternity leave at its own expense. So India, on the other hand, is reporting that there are something going on and it's going to cost India the policy. So what exactly is going on is what I ask in my paper. Can long paid maternity leave policy lead to unintended consequences for the female labor market? The country setting that I'm studying, of course, is India, and the time period for this policy, which is extension of the paid maternity leave policy, was 2017. The time period I will be studying is 2014 to 2020. I stop at 2020 because of COVID reasons. And I actually implement this in two-part empirical strategy, which I will briefly explain in a few minutes. But both of these empirical strategies are differences and differences. The first set of strategies looking at the firm side, or the industrial, the firm level survey data, where I will be utilizing the variation in the firm size. Unfortunately, due to lack of having matched employer-employee data like the previous paper, I have limited resources in that, and therefore I first look at the firm side, and then in order to be able to see what happens in the spillover or the other sectors of the economy, where are these women leading up to from these firms, I look at an individual panel survey data, and there I utilize the variation in employment industry. So I'm going to skip the preview in the interest of time. Very briefly on the contribution. So my paper looks at the impact of parental leave policies on labor force participation. The previous evidence till now has been pretty contrasting, especially for long leaves. There are certain papers which report improvements for female employment with similar policies, but there are also papers in developing countries which have negative impacts on the female labor. And both of these contrasting evidence are based, as Gabriel was mentioning, have differences in the ambiguity in these results are based on differences in the policy design and the economic conditions of the country. So those variations is what we really need to understand why countries have different results to paid maternity leaves. Another aspect is that most of the papers till now have focused on just the impact on mothers, but not in general on all the females who might or potentially be impacted, as firms cannot ex ante decide who is going to take a maternity leave or not. I do some work on fuzzy difference and difference, which is just touching upon it. And then lastly, I contribute to the disentangling of India's low female labor force participation rates. This has been a mystery for a lot of economists for the past decades and so. So we try to touch upon that. The flow will be as follows. So as just to give a brief idea of the Indian context, I know we are short on time, but India, relative to the world, has a very, very low and declining female labor force participation rate, and it has been a problem for decades, and economists consider motherhood penalty as part of it, but there are other factors as culture as well, which contribute to it. The timeline of India's maternity leave policy has been very unique. To give you a brief idea, we had one of the most progressive and earliest paid maternity leave for women, which was implemented in 1961, which gave women up to 12 weeks of paid maternity. There were very little changes to that besides some bonuses, but finally, after a lot of protests and public demand, there was a bill that was passed in August 2016, which increased these which was passed in 2016 in the parliament, but implemented actually in April 2017, which is where I'm studying. But this increased the leaves from 12 weeks to 26 weeks, which brings me to the next slide. What exactly the leave and the paid leave entailed was fully paid for mothers from 12 to 26 weeks. Now, this has some caveats. The leaves are only applicable for women who are employed in the organized formal sector, which essentially means they are under establishments with 10 or more workers. Another very different aspect of this Indian policy, which is very different from the developed country policies, is that all cost of this paid maternity is borne by the employers. So there is no government or social insurance that supports this. There were no additional provisions made for the fathers or women who are employed in the informal sector. So the policy is more than doubling the leaves for mothers, but there's zero leaves for fathers. There are certain different small caveats where firms with 50 plus employees also need to provide childcare, and they extended this policy for adoption and surrogacy as well. So the data that I will be using is in the first empirical strategy will be firm level data, which is the establishment annual survey of industries, which is a national representative cross-section of formal manufacturing firms in India. This is a principal industry statistic, so it's pretty commonly known and it's very reliable. The second source of data that I will be using for my individual panel will be the CPHS, which is Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. And this is, again, a very large national representative individual cross-survey panel of individuals. And it has comprehensive statistics on all women. And lastly, I will be also using the labor force survey for 2012, just for the use of creating a baseline formalization rates across industries. So now let's first let me explain the first empirical strategy. As I mentioned, I will be using the variation in the industry size, in the firm size. So what exactly I do is that firms who are 10 plus workers in size are eligible for providing their female workers with this maternity leave, while smaller firms do not. And therefore, I exploit this variation in my treatment dummy for the firms with 10 or plus employees. And post is just the policy timeline. And I put industry fixed effect state and time fixed effects. As you know, India is a pretty large state, so we need to have location as well. And what I do find, so there are 4 columns to it. The first column, which is share of female full-time employment. So this includes both the number of women and their hours worked. So we see a large, about 1 percentage point decline in the female full-time share. So this is not just the women, but the share of women. So female employment FTE to total FTE. And we see that there is a 1 percentage point decline. Now, when I break this down into what exactly is happening, that all of this negative effect on female employment is just coming from the number of the share of female employees in the firms. But the third column, which is the female shifts, which is essentially referring to how many, if a woman, given she is employed, how many hours or shifts she is working or not, there is no change in that. So essentially, given a woman is employed, she is working the same amount of hours as men, but there is a large reduction in the number of female employees. And there is, again, no difference in the shifts that are paid or unpaid. The event study graphs look like this. There seem to be no pre-trends. Now, when I look at the wage shares, the female wage bill, which is again the cost of the the female bill, all the wages paid to all females is the 1% reduction, but the wage rate for females is not declining. So given a woman is employed, she is not experiencing any reduction in her wages, but overall the total number of women employment is decreasing. Given this part of my analysis is only looking at the manufacturing formal sectors in India, which is very small part of, and there might be certain other reasons where these women might be going or leaving the manufacturing sector for certain other reasons. So I want to look at a more broader picture of where these women are going. I want to track them. So for this, I employ individual panel data, where I look at what these women, these individual firms, individual surveyed women, because I cannot exactly tell if they are working in a big firm or a small firm, I look at what industry were they working in baseline. And that industry has a baseline formalization rate, which is essentially this exposure index, the number of female employed in the treated firm over the total number of women employed in that particular industry. So to give you a little bit of context of what that means, let's say we have about 30 industries in India. On the left side, in the orange industries, you see industries which are relatively low female formalization, or very few women who are working in the formal sectors in these industries. On the right side are the high female formalization rates. So I'm comparing these women who are employed in the treated versus untreated industries at baseline. And then the rest is a regular DID setup with individual fixed effects. So what I do find is that the first column, which is looking at the outcome on employed, is there is not so much significant result on the number of women who are employed. So that means women are not getting unemployed because of the policy. But when I specifically look at that women employed in the treated industry, which is essentially high formal industries, we see a large decline in that. What it essentially is saying is that all these women who were initially employed at baseline in these industries are now moving towards from formal, high formal industries to low formal industries, or more towards informality. There is, when I look at the differences between where are these women going, or what are their responses to their barriers to their work, there is for those women who become unemployed, there's a large increase in willingness to work and a very large increase in their probability of becoming a homemaker. Or remaining unoccupied. So essentially, what these results show is that women who remain employed post-policy tend to either be employed in the informal sector, or if they become unemployed, they're becoming unemployed and they have a larger willingness to work, or they are more driven towards homemaker responsibilities. These are the results in event study form. For the homemaker, there are certain pre-trends which I'm trying to explore why exactly is that, but and they're similar to willingness to work. There's some lack. All right, so for robustness checks, I do this because the firms, when I'm in the first setup of my empirical strategy, there is you might argue that there's big firms versus small firms is not a perfect comparison group. So I do a lot of robustness around that with firm size from 1 to 10 to 10 to 20, and similarly much smaller. I do a placebo test on different cutoffs as well, and specification validity. And all of these results, as you can see in the paper, stand robust. I'm going to skip all of that. There are some additional results based on the treatment of 50 plus firms, which again, in the interest of time, I have to skip. So finally, to conclude, what this government initially intended with this policy of paid maternity leave was to reduce the female employment, the motherhood penalty, and bring back the women back to work after a longer leave. But what it actually does is the firms become apprehensive of that they will have to pay, which is all the cost borne by the employers, that they will have to pay this higher, longer leaves for women, and they end up decreasing their hiring and retention of female employees. So it's actually causing a negative impact on the female employment. We can't really distinguish if it's a supply side or a demand side effect, but most likely, as you can see from the mechanisms, it's that the women are still willing to work, so it could be a lot more on the demand side, but it's just an indicative result. And the policy itself is just changing the gender composition of the employed women itself, and they're driving them towards more informality. again, as the policy, as I would, this again is a personal note, but in the absence of a parental leave for fathers, but just a female leave, which is pretty long, there can be negative consequences to such a policy, and it's doing more harm in the case of India. Thank you.